After decades of observing brilliant minds enter doctoral programs only to emerge as academic technicians rather than true scholars, I have witnessed a tragedy that haunts our universities. The distinction between earning a PhD and becoming a genuine intellectual is profound, yet most students never grasp this essential difference. They master methodologies, accumulate citations, and defend dissertations, but fail to cultivate the contemplative habits that transform knowledge into wisdom. The modern academy has confused specialization with scholarship, producing experts who lack the integral vision that defines authentic intellectual life. Today, I reveal why this happens and how serious students can transcend mere academic training to embrace the sacred vocation of true scholarship, a path that unites rigorous investigation with contemplative depth, technical competence with moral formation, and professional achievement with service to eternal truth. Chapter 1: The Fatal Confusion Between Training and Formation. The modern university has created what I call the doctoral illusion, the belief that completing a PhD automatically produces a scholar. This confusion between training and formation represents the fundamental error that derails most academic careers before they truly begin. Training, you see, focuses on acquiring techniques, mastering methodologies, and learning to navigate academic systems. Formation, however, shapes the entire person, developing intellectual virtues that enable one to pursue truth with both competence and wisdom. The contemporary doctoral student learns to write grant proposals but never develops the habit of sustained contemplation. They master citation formats but never learn to read for transformation rather than information. I have observed this tragedy repeatedly. Brilliant students who enter graduate programs with genuine love for truth gradually become academic bureaucrats, skilled in the mechanics of research but devoid of the contemplative spirit that animates authentic scholarship. They learn to publish papers but never develop the patience for deep reflection. They master academic jargon but lose the ability to think clearly about fundamental questions. The root of this problem lies in a false conception of intellectual work itself. Modern academic culture treats scholarship as a profession rather than a vocation, as a career path rather than a sacred calling. This utilitarian approach produces technicians who manipulate ideas rather than scholars who serve truth. True formation requires what our Dominican tradition calls studium, not mere study, but disciplined contemplation ordered toward wisdom. This involves developing intellectual virtues, patience for sustained investigation, humility before the complexity of truth, courage to pursue difficult questions, and temperance in judgment. These virtues cannot be taught through workshops or seminars, they must be cultivated through years of contemplative practice. The contemplative dimension distinguishes authentic scholarship from mere academic productivity. While the trained researcher produces output, the formed scholar undergoes transformation. While the academic professional accumulates credentials, the true intellectual develops character. While the degree holder masters techniques, the scholar becomes a servant of truth. This is why many PhD holders remain intellectually immature despite their impressive qualifications. They have been trained but not formed, educated but not transformed, certified but not consecrated to the pursuit of wisdom. Chapter 2: The Seduction of Specialization Without Synthesis. The second great trap that prevents PhD students from becoming true scholars is the modern obsession with hyperspecialization at the expense of synthetic vision. Contemporary academic culture rewards narrow expertise while discouraging the integral understanding that characterizes authentic intellectual life. I witness doctoral students who can analyze minute details within their subspecialty but cannot articulate how their research connects to broader questions of human meaning and truth. They become experts in increasingly smaller domains while losing sight of the whole that gives significance to the parts. This fragmentation produces academic myopia, scholars who know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing that truly matters. The seduction of specialization is powerful because it offers the illusion of mastery. Within a narrow field, one can achieve a sense of comprehensive knowledge and professional authority. The specialized researcher can dominate conferences, control academic conversations, and build a career on incremental contributions to an ever-shrinking domain. But this apparent success masks a deeper failure, the inability to think synthetically about fundamental questions. True scholarship requires what Thomas Aquinas demonstrated supremely, the ability to integrate particular insights into a coherent vision of reality. The authentic scholar sees connections between disciplines, recognizes universal principles operating in specific phenomena, and understands how individual discoveries illuminate broader truths about existence. This synthetic capacity depends on contemplative habits that modern academia actively discourages. Synthesis requires silence for reflection, time for integration, and the intellectual courage to venture beyond one's certified area of expertise. But contemporary academic pressures, publish or perish, grant deadlines, conference presentations, create a frantic pace that militates against the contemplative conditions necessary for synthetic thinking. Moreover, the reward structures of modern universities penalize synthetic thinking while incentivizing narrow specialization. Tenure committees prefer candidates with focused research programs over those who think across disciplines. Journal editors favor technical contributions over synthetic insights. Graduate advisors counsel students to find their niche rather than develop broad intellectual vision. The tragic result is a generation of PhD holders who are intellectually provincial despite their advanced training. They cannot engage educated general audiences because they have lost the ability to translate specialized knowledge into broader wisdom. They cannot contribute to public discourse because they think only within academic silos. They cannot even collaborate effectively with colleagues in related fields because they lack the synthetic vision necessary for genuine interdisciplinary dialogue. The path beyond this trap requires recovering what I call contemplative breadth, the disciplined cultivation of intellectual connections across the artificial boundaries that compartmentalize modern knowledge. This demands reading beyond one's field, reflecting on fundamental questions that transcend disciplinary categories, and developing the intellectual virtue of prudence that enables one to see particular truths within universal contexts. Chapter 3: The Productivity Trap That Destroys Contemplative Depth. The third obstacle that prevents doctoral students from achieving true scholarship is the contemporary obsession with productivity metrics that prioritize quantity over quality, output over insight, and publication over contemplation. This productivity trap transforms potential scholars into academic content producers who mistake busyness for intellectual achievement. Modern PhD students are trained to think like factories, input resources, process efficiently, generate measurable output. They learn to track publications, count citations, and optimize research workflows. This industrial mentality infects their approach to ideas, reducing intellectual life to a series of production targets rather than a contemplative engagement with truth. I observe students who cannot read a single book slowly and thoroughly because they feel pressure to consume vast quantities of literature. They skim rather than contemplate, accumulate rather than digest, and survey rather than penetrate. The result is a superficial familiarity with many sources but deep understanding of none. This productivity obsession reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how authentic intellectual discovery occurs. True insights emerge not from processing information efficiently but from sustained contemplative engagement with difficult questions. Breakthrough understanding requires what I call intellectual patience, the willingness to dwell with uncertainty, to sit with complexity, and to allow ideas to mature through prolonged reflection. The contemplative tradition teaches that depth cannot be rushed. Thomas Aquinas spent years contemplating single questions, allowing his understanding to develop organically through prayer, study, and reflection. His greatest insights emerged not from rapid production but from patient contemplation that gradually illuminated fundamental principles. Contemporary academic culture, however, penalizes this contemplative approach. Students feel pressure to demonstrate progress through tangible outputs, completed chapters, submitted papers, conference presentations. The academic calendar imposes artificial deadlines that fragment natural thinking processes. Funding cycles demand premature results from investigations that require years of sustained contemplation. This productivity trap also corrupts the relationship between thinking and writing. Instead of using writing as a contemplative tool for developing and clarifying ideas, students learn to write strategically for specific audiences and publication venues. They master the art of academic prose, verbose, cautious, laden with qualifications, but lose the ability to think clearly and express insight simply. The deeper problem is that productivity culture treats ideas as commodities rather than gifts to be received through contemplative openness. The authentic scholar knows that the most important insights cannot be manufactured through efficient processes but must be discovered through patient attention to reality. This requires intellectual humility, the recognition that truth reveals itself to those who wait upon it with disciplined attention rather than those who try to extract it through aggressive methodologies. Breaking free from the productivity trap requires what I call contemplative courage, the willingness to appear unproductive while engaging in the deep work of authentic thinking. This means learning to read slowly, to write contemplatively, and to resist the pressure for premature publication in favor of mature insight. Chapter 4: The Absence of Intellectual Virtue and Moral Formation. The fourth critical failure in contemporary doctoral education is the complete neglect of intellectual virtue and moral formation. Modern programs train students in research methodologies but ignore the character development that enables authentic scholarship. This produces technically competent researchers who lack the moral foundation necessary for genuine intellectual achievement. Intellectual virtue encompasses habits of mind that order one's relationship to truth, humility before the complexity of reality, courage to pursue difficult questions despite opposition, temperance in judgment that avoids premature conclusions, and justice that gives proper credit to sources and predecessors. These virtues cannot be acquired through coursework but must be cultivated through sustained practice under the guidance of exemplary mentors. Contemporary academic culture, however, actively militates against intellectual virtue. The competitive nature of graduate programs encourages intellectual pride rather than humility. Students learn to defend positions aggressively rather than seek truth collaboratively. They master the art of academic one-upmanship, finding flaws in others' work to advance their own careers, rather than developing the generous spirit that characterizes authentic scholarship. The absence of moral formation is particularly evident in how students approach intellectual disagreement. Instead of viewing opposing viewpoints as opportunities to test and refine their understanding, they treat critics as enemies to be defeated. They learn rhetorical strategies for demolishing opponents rather than contemplative practices for integrating partial truths into more comprehensive insights. This moral deficiency undermines the contemplative conditions necessary for authentic intellectual work. Pride closes the mind to unexpected insights. Ambition corrupts the pure intention necessary for discovering truth. Envy distorts one's perception of others' contributions. Without the purification that comes through moral discipline, even the most technically proficient researcher remains incapable of the selfless attention that enables genuine discovery. The Dominican tradition understands that intellectual work is fundamentally a moral endeavor. To think clearly about reality requires not only trained reasoning but purified intention. The scholar must approach truth with what we call intellectual chastity, a detached love that seeks understanding for its own sake rather than for personal advancement. This moral dimension explains why some individuals with modest formal training become profound thinkers while others with extensive academic credentials remain intellectually superficial. Character matters more than methodology. Virtue enables insight more than technique. The humble autodidact often surpasses the proud PhD because moral receptivity opens the mind to truth while intellectual vice closes it. Modern doctoral programs could dramatically improve by recovering the ancient understanding that intellectual formation is inseparable from moral development. This requires mentorship relationships that model intellectual virtue, contemplative practices that purify intention, and community structures that encourage collaborative rather than competitive approaches to learning. The authentic scholar must cultivate what I call intellectual poverty, the recognition that one's understanding is always incomplete and dependent on the generosity of truth itself. This humility enables the contemplative openness through which genuine insights are received rather than manufactured. Chapter 5: The Loss of Contemplative Reading and Deep Study Habits. The fifth tragedy I observe in contemporary doctoral education is the systematic destruction of contemplative reading habits that form the foundation of authentic scholarship. Modern students learn to consume texts efficiently but never develop the deeper capacity for what our tradition calls lectio, the contemplative engagement with texts that transforms both reader and reading. Contemporary academic culture treats reading as information extraction rather than contemplative encounter. Students learn to scan for relevant data, identify key arguments, and process sources efficiently for their own research purposes. They master speed reading techniques, develop sophisticated note-taking systems, and learn to navigate vast bibliographies with digital efficiency. But they never learn to read contemplatively, to allow a text to question their assumptions, challenge their perspectives, and gradually transform their understanding. This instrumental approach to reading reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how wisdom is acquired. True learning occurs not through accumulating information but through being formed by sustained engagement with profound minds. When one reads Aristotle or Aquinas contemplatively, the encounter changes not only what one knows but how one thinks. The reader's mind is gradually shaped by the discipline and clarity of the master's thought. Contemplative reading requires what I call intellectual reverence, the recognition that great texts deserve patient attention rather than utilitarian exploitation. This means reading slowly enough to follow the author's reasoning carefully, quietly enough to hear subtle distinctions, and humbly enough to be corrected by superior insight. It requires what our monastic tradition calls rumination, returning repeatedly to the same passages until their full significance is absorbed. Modern doctoral students, however, are trained to read strategically rather than contemplatively. They learn to identify what serves their immediate research needs while ignoring broader insights that might expand their understanding. They approach texts with predetermined agendas rather than openness to unexpected discovery. They read to confirm existing positions rather than to be challenged and changed. This loss of contemplative reading habits has profound consequences for intellectual development. Without sustained engagement with masterworks, students never develop the refined judgment that comes from prolonged exposure to first-rate minds. They cannot distinguish between profound insights and clever observations because they have never internalized the criteria of excellence that emerge only through contemplative study of exemplary works. Moreover, instrumental reading fails to develop what I call intellectual sympathy, the ability to understand authors on their own terms before attempting criticism. Contemporary students learn to approach texts with hermeneutics of suspicion, seeking hidden biases and unconscious assumptions rather than striving first to understand what authors actually thought and why their insights proved compelling to serious minds across centuries. The contemplative tradition offers a different model, reading as spiritual exercise, as formation of mind and character, as preparation for the receptive attention that enables discovery. This requires developing what medieval scholars called the interior book, the capacity to carry insights from reading into sustained reflection until they become part of one's own intellectual vision. Recovering contemplative reading habits requires practical discipline, choosing quality over quantity, depth over coverage, formation over information. It means selecting a few profound works for intensive study rather than surveying vast literatures superficially. It means reading with pen in hand, not to extract quotations but to engage in written dialogue with the author. It means creating space for reflection between reading sessions, allowing insights to mature through contemplative gestation. Chapter 6: The Corruption of Writing as Contemplative Practice. The sixth critical failure in contemporary doctoral formation involves the systematic corruption of writing from a contemplative practice into mere academic performance. Modern students learn to write strategically for publication and professional advancement but never discover writing's true potential as a tool for developing and clarifying authentic insight. In our Dominican tradition, writing serves primarily as an instrument of contemplative discovery. When Thomas Aquinas composed his Summa, he was not merely communicating pre-existing knowledge but thinking through fundamental questions with systematic precision. The act of writing forced him to clarify distinctions, resolve apparent contradictions, and organize insights into coherent synthetic vision. Writing was integral to his contemplative method, not separate from it. Contemporary academic writing, however, has become divorced from authentic thinking. Students learn to construct arguments that will satisfy committee members, impress journal editors, and advance their careers rather than to use writing as a means of genuine intellectual development. They master the conventions of academic prose, the hedging qualifications, the defensive citations, the strategic positioning relative to existing literature, but never experience writing as contemplative exploration. This corruption begins with the fundamental misconception that one should know what one wants to say before beginning to write. Students are taught to develop thesis statements, create detailed outlines, and construct arguments systematically from predetermined conclusions. This approach treats writing as the communication of settled insights rather than as a method for discovering what one actually thinks about complex questions. Authentic contemplative writing works differently. One begins with genuine uncertainty about difficult questions and uses the discipline of written articulation to develop understanding gradually. The process of finding precise words for subtle distinctions, of organizing complex relationships into clear sequences, of testing insights against potential objections, this contemplative labor enables discoveries that would never emerge through mere thinking. I observe PhD students who can discuss their research topics fluently in conversation but struggle to write clearly about the same material. This reveals that their apparent understanding remains superficial. They have learned to manipulate academic vocabulary without developing genuine clarity about fundamental issues. Clear writing requires clear thinking, and the discipline of contemplative composition exposes and corrects intellectual confusion. Modern academic culture also corrupts writing through its obsession with strategic positioning and competitive advantage. Students learn to frame their contributions relative to existing debates, to identify gaps in current scholarship, and to demonstrate the significance of their work for advancing knowledge. This external orientation prevents the interior focus necessary for contemplative discovery. The contemplative writer, by contrast, approaches questions with what I call intellectual poverty, the humble recognition that one's understanding is incomplete and that the process of careful articulation might reveal unexpected insights. This requires the courage to begin writing before one knows exactly what one wants to say, trusting that the discipline of composition will gradually clarify one's authentic thinking. Moreover, contemporary academic writing prioritizes impression management over truth-seeking. Students learn to write defensively, anticipating objections and hedging claims to avoid criticism. They master the art of saying very little with great sophistication, producing prose that appears scholarly while avoiding substantive commitments. This protective approach militates against the intellectual courage necessary for genuine discovery. Recovering writing as contemplative practice requires fundamental reorientation. Instead of writing to demonstrate mastery, one writes to discover truth. Instead of writing strategically for specific audiences, One writes honestly about genuine questions. Instead of writing efficiently to meet deadlines, one writes patiently until clarity emerges through sustained engagement with difficult issues. This contemplative approach to writing transforms the entire scholarly enterprise from performance to pilgrimage, from professional positioning to authentic seeking. Chapter 7: The Path to Authentic Scholarly Formation. Having diagnosed the failures that prevent most PhD students from becoming true scholars, I must now illuminate the alternative path, the contemplative formation that enables authentic intellectual achievement. This transformation requires not merely correcting particular habits but embracing an entirely different understanding of what scholarship means and how it develops. The foundation of authentic scholarly formation is the recovery of intellectual life as sacred vocation rather than professional career. The true scholar recognizes that thinking is not merely a cognitive activity but a spiritual discipline that participates in humanity's fundamental orientation toward truth. This vocational consciousness transforms one's entire approach to learning, from the selection of questions to the methods of investigation to the purposes of communication. Central to this transformation is the cultivation of contemplative habits that order one's relationship to reality. This begins with the practice of sustained attention, the disciplined capacity to remain focused on difficult questions despite the distractions that characterize modern intellectual life. Contemporary culture fragments attention through constant stimulation, but the contemplative scholar learns to create and protect space for deep engagement with fundamental issues. The development of contemplative attention requires practical asceticism adapted to intellectual life. This includes disciplined control of media consumption, strategic solitude that enables sustained reflection, and the cultivation of silence that allows subtle insights to emerge. The scholar must learn to resist the contemporary addiction to stimulation and develop comfort with the emptiness that precedes authentic discovery. Equally important is the recovery of reading as contemplative encounter rather than information processing. This requires developing what I call bibliographical prudence, the wisdom to select texts that will form rather than merely inform one's understanding. Better to engage deeply with a few masterworks than to survey vast literature superficially. The contemplative scholar seeks not comprehensive coverage but transformative encounter with minds of the first order. This contemplative approach to reading must be supported by practices that enable sustained engagement, keeping a reading journal for recording insights and questions, developing the habit of rereading significant passages until their full import is absorbed, and creating regular opportunities for reflection that allow reading to mature into understanding. The authentic scholar must also recover writing as contemplative practice rather than strategic communication. This requires the intellectual courage to begin writing about questions one does not yet understand fully, trusting that the discipline of articulation will gradually clarify one's authentic thinking. Such writing serves discovery rather than demonstration, exploration rather than exhibition. Perhaps most importantly, the path to authentic scholarship requires finding or creating intellectual community that supports contemplative formation rather than competitive positioning. The isolated scholar rarely achieves the synthetic vision that characterizes authentic intellectual achievement. One needs conversation partners who can challenge assumptions, test insights, and provide the charitable criticism that enables genuine development. This community should include both contemporaries and the great minds of the tradition. The contemplative scholar enters into ongoing dialogue with authors across centuries, recognizing that intellectual formation requires initiation into a living tradition rather than mere training in current methodologies. Finally, the authentic scholar must cultivate intellectual virtue through sustained practice, the humility that enables learning from others, the courage to pursue difficult questions despite professional risks, the temperance that prevents premature judgment, and the justice that gives proper credit to sources and predecessors. This path requires what I call intellectual conversion, a fundamental reorientation from self-advancement to truth-seeking, from professional success to contemplative service. Conclusion. The tragedy of contemporary doctoral education is not that it fails to produce competent researchers, but that it systematically prevents the emergence of authentic scholars, minds capable of synthetic vision, contemplative depth, and genuine contribution to humanity's understanding of reality. Most PhD holders remain intellectual technicians rather than true servants of wisdom because they have been trained rather than formed, educated rather than transformed. The path I have illuminated requires nothing less than intellectual conversion, from viewing scholarship as career to embracing it as vocation, from seeking professional advancement to serving truth itself, from competing for academic position to collaborating in the great human enterprise of understanding. This transformation cannot be achieved through workshops or methodologies but only through sustained contemplative practice that gradually purifies intention and clarifies vision. I invite you to embrace this more demanding but infinitely more rewarding path. Begin with small steps, read one classic work contemplatively rather than surveying vast literature strategically. Write one page in genuine exploration rather than producing volumes of defensive prose. Cultivate one friendship based on shared love of truth rather than networking for professional advantage. Remember that authentic scholarship serves not only your own development but humanity's deepest needs. In an age of fragmentation and confusion, the world desperately needs minds capable of synthetic wisdom, contemplative depth, and genuine insight. This is your calling, not merely to earn credentials but to become a servant of truth for the sake of all who seek understanding.